Wow, good morning. It is, it's really moving. This is the first time I've been really back in this hall for over a year. It felt like a really important time to be able to remember what it's like to really orient in the temple, through the temple. So, welcome. Feel free to make yourselves more comfortable. I hope everybody who's in the hall and outside the hall, in the garden, is warm enough. And howdy to online folks. Yeah. So every Dharma talk, like every life, is a patchwork, an assembly of gathered scraps. I'm hoping I can stitch these pieces together. These days, more and more, I think that a life of faith is not a seamless one. I think that the luminous moon is packed and pocked with craters, that every bowl of water, full and clear and transparent, is in truth a mirror, but a mirror crazed with cracks. And I strive these days more and more with a faith that simply holds the torn edges up against each other, a stubborn intimacy of wound and wound, alive with the hope that faith, stupid and stubborn faith, will allow the tissues to do their natural work and heal. How are you all, by the way?
You want to do it now?
Yeah, not a rhetorical question. How are you? The world is kind of broken and torn. Yeah? Sort of an unholy mess these days, a little bit. Am I the only one who is feeling that? Yeah. Broken and torn and seemingly on the edge of conflagration and collapse and calamity. Cheerful words. In all this mess, how does awakening, how does the luminous heart of wisdom appear? How can it possibly appear? Where can it possibly appear? Where is there room in the brokenness for it to appear? This is the question of suffering, right? The question of suffering, the question of how can awakening appear in this? It's a question that I'm thinking of you on you. This is a question that we chaplains get asked a lot. One version of this question, it's not even a question when people ask it, it's more like a head shake, like, I don't know how you do what you're doing. You know, how do you chaplains do what you're doing? A little side, maybe funny story. I was taking off PPE the other day and taking my cell phone out of the plastic bag that sort of protects it and dumping it out. And the National Guard's guy who was in the hospital, one of the folks there from the National Guard was working as the doffisser, the person helping you doff your PPE correctly. And he said, how do you do it? And it's like, well, you take the cell phone out of the bag like, oh, how do you do it? Got it. Oh. I was like, you do it like this. Oh, okay, you're asking that question. You know, another version of the question, more heartrending version of the question, is, how can this happen to me? How is this happening? How can this be? Right? People wondering how we can find goodness, right? How do you do it? How can you find goodness in the middle of this world, right? How? How do we do it? These are simple questions, but they carry the heart of everything. How does awakening appear in the world? How does the luminous heart of wisdom appear? So over the past few Dharma talks and Teisho and teachings, Ejo has been inviting us to appreciate the ways in which awakening appears in the world as a temple, right? As an abbot laying out the clear, full heart of his intention, his vow. Awakening appears as a temple, as a hall of assembly. Assembly, like assembling the parts together. Patchwork. Awakening appears right here and now, right here and now. And Ejo's invited us next week as he ascends the mountain, the ceremony known as the mountain seat ceremony, ascending the mountain, as he's installed as Buddha Ai's first ever abbot, opening the gate, opening the office of the abbot, opening this place as a place of assembly, a place of awakening, which it's always been, but now can be maybe seen as such in a new light, in a new way. So one answer to the question, how does awakening appear in the world? It appears as an assembly. Well, Monday through Friday we chant the words of the Buddha from the Lotus Sutra, from the verse of the lifespan. We chant, when beings have become sincerely faithful, honest and upright, with gentle intention, wholeheartedly wishing to behold the Buddha, not begrudging their own bodily lives, then I, says the Buddha, then I and the assembled Sangha appear together on sacred Vulture Peak. Then I and the assembled Sangha appear together on sacred Vulture Peak. And he goes on to say, with such pervasive spiritual power, and this is the verse that Edge was saying, it's his favorite verse in the verse of lifespan, maybe his favorite verse in any sutra, with such pervasive spiritual power for uncountable kalpas, enormous, unimaginable lengths of time, for uncountable kalpas, here's the money verse, I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place. I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place. Ejo has been inviting us to ask what it means for the Buddha to appear in the world, and he has shared with us that line of sutra that tells us the Buddha appears on sacred Vulture Peak with the assembled Sangha, and thus he appears in every dwelling place. The answer is right here, the answer is everywhere. The mountain is our own awakening heart. A temple appears in the world so that we carry that temple everywhere. It's our own awakening heart. Now, this is a segue, but not much of a segue. My favorite line of Carl Jung's, the psychologist Carl Jung, whose works are really hard to read, so this may be the only line that I fully understand. It's from his biography. He says, the decisive question for human being, Carl Jung says, the decisive question for a human being is, are they related to anything infinite or not? The decisive question for a human being is, are they related to anything infinite or not? That's the decisive question. Now Jung, when he asks this question, is, forgive me, my old Shakespeare professor heart here, he's asking like the same question that Hamlet asks, from Jung to Hamlet. What is a man? Hamlet's really outraged. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time, if the chief good and market of his time is but to sleep and feed, a beast no more? So, Hamlet's asking, well, what are we if all we're doing is just going along to get along, right? Is there anything infinite that we relate to? Is there anything beyond just this, going along to get along? Are we going to be animals? This is Hamlet's denigrating animals, but we won't go there. Are we going to be animals, or are we going to connect? Are we going to relate to the infinite? Now, for me, the $64,000 question here is not, are we going to relate to the infinite, but how is it that the infinite can relate to anything, right? I mean, the infinite, totally boundless, immeasurable. Relation is all about parts connecting to parts, right? Relation is, by definition, something that's about measurement. relating one thing to another. So the infinite in its vastness, in its unfolding mountain hugeness, in its unimaginable kalpa-length breadth, how could the infinite, in its undifferentiated nature, how could it relate to anything? How could the mountain relate to anything? So the world's monotheist traditions, I'm thinking here of, the Abrahamic three of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they have an answer for this question. How does the infinite relate to the world? And their answer is the myth of creation, right? Their answer is stuff like the incarnation and sacrament, these ways in which this monotheist vision of the deity in all their infinitude willfully narrows themselves down to be present for finitude. My favorite version of this, Ezra, you'll like this, I'm bringing this in. My favorite, pointing to my husband over there, my favorite, talk about relating, my favorite version of this is the Jewish Kabbalistic idea of tzimtzum, the idea of a divine contraction, that God, in the infinite light of God's radiance, contracts, brings into itself all of its radiance to create a void. So God clears the room, as it were, in order to create room for creation. That's the monotheist answer to this, that the infinite withdraws, separates out to create room for everything else. So I bring this up because this way of understanding how the infinite can relate to the finite basically says the infinite is over there, completely separate from here by definition, right? That's not the way Buddhism answers the question. That's not what the Buddha says when he says, I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place, or when, at the moment of awakening, the Buddha says, I, together with all beings in this great earth, simultaneously attain the way. I, together with all beings in the great earth, simultaneously attain the way. I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place. So Buddhism does not give us a creation myth or a universe centered monotheistically on an absolute deity. At the center of the Buddhist worldview, a mountain appears, but it never stands alone. It's huge. That's mountainous. A mountain appears, a temple appears, a temple arises, but never stands alone. So, true story. For me, one day, the luminous heart of wisdom appeared as I had my hands curled around a cup of tea on a break at Great Vow Zen Monastery during a week-long meditation intensive, Rohatsu Sesshin. I was just sitting there in the break room, drinking my tea, daydreaming. I'm sure I'm the only person here who's ever daydreamed in the middle of a retreat. In fact, I was thinking about like all the things I wanted, like all the stuff, and all the people that I yearned for and that I was missing. I was just like one great big ball of yearning. I'm drinking my tea, which was good tea, but I was yearning. And then the thought occurred to me, like, what if I could unhook this yearning from the objects of the yearning? Like that thought, just to, like, could I do that? It was just like a random fourth day of sesshin kind of thought. And I can describe, I don't really even remember this exactly. Like, I can't remember exactly what this felt like. But suddenly there was just love. Just love. And I'm like, because, little Myobun was still there, like, discoursing away on the experience. But so little Myobun is going, oh, this is cool. I wonder if there's anything other than this love right now. And so I started to think, like, cast my mind around, cast my eyes about the room, like looking for the people who annoyed me. Again, I think I'm like the only person on sesshin who's ever been annoyed by the other. Am I actually the only person? Like, oh my God, I can't believe the way that person chews, So I was looking around the room, like looking for the people who annoyed me, and like, oh, no, just love. Oh, no. Wow, just like poking at the edges of the love and like, oh yeah, just love. So I was like, wow, love. And I remember going to Sanzen, and I don't even remember what I said, but I think I probably just, oh, love. And Echo said, sit like a mountain. And I do remember what I said next, because I was like, that's just it, I'm shaking. Because I'm like, adrenalized. I'm sure oxytocin is pouring through my body, so I'm like, just a quiver. I'm like, I'm shaking. And I remember, Ejo, you said something like, yeah, the mountain, it has birds and rivers and valleys and caves and aspen trees fluttering. It's like, oh. The mountain includes everything. Sit like a mountain. The love thing faded. Don't worry. I stopped being a quiver with love. The mountain includes everything, which is really good because I don't actually get mountains. Like I grew up on the North Shore of Chicago, okay? I grew up in like the flattest of the flat, right? Just a block away or half a block away from Lake Michigan, which, it's a great lake. It's a great lake. It's huge, right? That's the thing about the Great Lakes, but they're lakes. There's no tide. There aren't really waves, It's just flat, blue, steel expanse of water. Like the whole landscape is flat, broken only by the skyline of Chicago, which is a nice skyline, but flat, right? So I don't really get mountains. I understand, that our tradition, Soto Zen, coming from Japan, from a land that is more than 80% mountains, I get that the image of mountain and the temple as a mountain, in a place where temples are actually in the foothills of mountains, I get it, like here, but in my heart, I'm a flatlander, So it's a good thing that the mountain includes everything because my psychic landscape is flat, ringed with rocks and lake. And I share this both because, I'm sharing and it's relevant, I think, in the imagery of it, but also to invite all of us. The wonderful thing about having this tradition with its imagery and its stories and its metaphors is the encouragement to experience the tradition through our images, to interpret the landscape of the ancestors through our own psychic landscape. Mine is flat, ringed with rocks and a lake. Growing up on by the beach of Lake Michigan, there are these rocks that I guess, there was a lot of landfill where I grew up, so I think the rocks were trying to keep the water at bay, as it were. But they just really encouraged, kids and teenagers to clamber on the rocks. And in the wintertime, because it was a lake, it froze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So there would be ice formations out onto the lake, which were also like the rocks, and so you'd want to clamber there. I remember, I'm not sure if this is a true story. It doesn't, as I tell the story to myself, I'm like, this couldn't have happened. I remember once seeing a dead body on the rocks, and it was green. I was like maybe 10 or 12, I think. I know for sure that at the age of 7, clambering out on the ice one winter, I fell into the lake, and it hit me about chest level, and I was a little girl, and I was really cold, and I probably would have died, but my dad knew that I was there, and he came, and he pulled me out very heroically, and I spent the rest of the afternoon in a big clawfoot bathtub filled with hot water in my parents' bathroom, and it was delicious, and probably the reason I love hot tubs so much these days. This is my psychic landscape. I have this recurring image from my dreams. I get this image a lot, where I'm climbing the rocks by a body of water, and it's maybe a lake. It might be a sea, but it's not like a crazy ocean. It's flat. and I'm climbing the rocks. The most recent time I had this dream, I was wearing roller skates, so it was really hard to climb the rocks. You know, dream images, you gotta love them. And I'm climbing, and what typically happens is I'm climbing up, but the water is also kind of rising up, or maybe the rocks are going down. So I'm climbing up, but I'm actually descending in that kind of dream logic, and I'm getting wetter and wetter, and I'm worried that I'm going to be submerged. Right? That the water and the rocks and the climbing and the descending, it's all mingling together. And I'm sorry to say that up until now, in each of the dreams that I've had this image, I've turned back. It's a little too overwhelming, too much rock, too much water, too much climbing, too much descending. So I've turned back. The Buddha says, I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place. I, together with all beings and the great earth, simultaneously attain the way. So this koan, a temple, appears in the world so that we can find the mountain heights right in the flatlands too. Edjo has been sharing with us a version of this koan of a temple, a mountain appearing at the same time that the flats are also heights. He's been sharing an image of this koan in the case of the 15th ancestor, Kanadeva. In Kanadeva's encounter, his transmission face-to-face with the great Indian sage Nagarjuna. This is the 2nd century Common Era, right? And Edjo's been sharing this story, as I understand it, as an image of the way in which the temple invites us to the mountain that we already are. I want to talk a little bit more about this case and about this meeting between Kanadeva and Nagarjuna, because I want to talk a little bit more, explore a little bit more the way in which the rocks and the beach and the mountain and the depths, the way in which this whole unholy mess of our lives is a place of awakening. I want us to talk a little bit more, explore a little bit more together the way in which the mountain appears as an assembly, a patchwork of parts. Of course, in the story, especially as Kazan tells it in the Transmission of Light, the story doesn't make this look like a patchwork. The story makes this look like perfection. Right? So I first encountered this story in Thomas Cleary's translation. I'm just going to read it again. Some of us have heard it several times, but hopefully repetition is a good thing. Yeah, okay. It's just nodding. Yes, repetition. Kanadeva visited the great master, Nagarjuna. Knowing he was a man of wisdom, Nagarjuna sent an attendant out to place a bowl full of water in front of Kanadeva, just as the latter was about to reach the gate. Nagarjuna then watched to see what Kanadeva would do. Kanadeva placed a needle on the surface of the water. Now, Ed just pointed out that there's a problem with that translation, and I've seen other translations too, where it's either he cast the needle in or he thrust the needle in, but Cleary states it this way. He placed a needle on the surface of the water and brought it with him to meet Nagarjuna. Happily, they had a meeting of minds. So Kanadeva took the needle from his robe. Monks have like 3 possessions: a robe, a bowl, and a needle to repair the robe once it's torn. Right? So he took one of his 3 possessions and he placed it on the water or cast it in the water. Cleary is envisioning this meeting as something miraculous. So he's envisioning it as like this placing of the needle on the water and the needle not sinking. The water is like all surface. And Cleary's playing on the ways in which that bowl of water is a precious mirror that it's all reflecting surface. What I think is wonderful, I'm a flatlander, right? So I'm like, it's all surface, that's magical, that's fantastic. It sort of doesn't matter though, because the story as it unfolds is all about the ways in which surface and depth are not two, the ways in which mountain and flatlands and cavernous caves, these are not separate. So Cleary goes on to say, or his translation of Kazan's words goes on to say, no, I got it here. Since it was a full bowl, there was no lack. This is also still water, absolutely clear, pure throughout, expansive, filling. It is aware and radiant. Therefore, Kanadeva put a needle on the water and met with understanding. Round and bright. This is Cleary's translation of Kazan. Round and bright, without form, it is like the transparency of clear water. Now this description of the bowl, right? The bowl of water and the needle, the meeting of Nagarjuna and the person who is about to be his Dharma heir of Kanadeva with the needle. That meeting is now a description of mind, of what mind is, of what the great luminous heart of awakening is. Round and bright without form, it is like the transparency of clear water. It is like penetrating through the spiritual noumenon and seeking the spiritual sword. The point, the needle's point, right? The point appears everywhere. Clear and bright, it pervades the mind. Water, too, pierces mountains with its flow and inundates the skies, and a needle penetrates a bag and pierces a seed. Yet water is, after all, not destroyed by anything. How could there be any tracks made in it? And a needle, to other things, is harder than diamond. Kanadeva's needle, Nagarjuna's water, not two, right? The needle pierces, right? The water also penetrates. Wisdom, compassion, the two wings of enlightenment, these are not two here. The mind of the teacher, the mind of Kanadeva, these are not two. This is the meeting at the heart of awakening, the assembly at the heart of awakening. This is the mountain. This is what it looks like to ascend the mountain. Pretty intimidating, I think, right? Right? The clarity of the water, the penetration of the needle, the way of surface and depth becoming not two. This is Kazan, 55th ancestor, telling the story of the 15th ancestor. This is what it looks like after the fact, perhaps, right? If you want to tell how the luminous heart appears in the moment, this is what it looks like. This is, this is a snow filling a bowl, a silver bowl, right? This is a needle perfectly held in a bowl of water. But I have to think that Kanadeva was probably shaking when this happened. One of three possessions. You cast your needle away. If your robe gets torn, you're not going to be able to mend it. The sort of commitment becomes really literal. Like, okay, I am now living a mortal life of shreds and tatters. Here I go. And Kanadeva, that name, Kanadeva, it literally means one-eyed deva, like the eye of a needle. Kanadeva is himself the needle, right? We've talked about this before. I just shared with us this image of Kanadeva as the needle as our own heart. But I can't imagine that Kanadeva isn't wobbly at this moment. How could he not have been shaking as he tried to thread this moment of his life perfectly? Every Dharma talk, like every life, is a patchwork, an assembly of gathered scraps. I'm hoping I can stitch these pieces together. These days, more and more, I think that a life of faith is not a seamless one. I think that the luminous moon is pocked with craters, that every bowl of water, full and clear and transparent, is in truth a mirror, but a mirror crazed with cracks. And I strive these days more and more with a faith that simply holds the torn edges up against each other. A stubborn intimacy of wound and wound, alive with the hope that faith, stupid and stubborn faith, will allow the tissues to do their natural work and heal. Here's a true story. During the 6th century BCE, that's about the same time as the Buddha, okay? 6th century BCE. Also in India, modern plastic surgery was born. True story. This is part of the tradition known as Ayurveda, right? The knowledge Veda of life, Ayus. So there's this Indian physician named Sushruta. He wrote what is one of the oldest medical treatises. He's known as the father of surgery. In this treatise, written around the same time as the Buddha, Sushruta is talking about, he describes like 1,100 different diseases, talks about their origins, their causes, their treatments, and he talks very, very, in very detailed terms about surgery, like how you do it. He actually, one of the surgeries that he talks about is a surgery that we know today. It's called forehead flap rhinoplasty. Okay, it's a technique that we still use today in which I'm just going to read from my notes here. A full thickness piece of skin from the forehead is used to reconstruct a nose. Sushruta, if he didn't invent that, he certainly formalized it and wrote it down. Now, why was he doing nose jobs in the 6th century BCE? Well, nose amputation was a really common way of punishing criminals and adulterers. And if you were a woman, you didn't have to actually be proved to be an adulterer. You could just be accused and your nose would be cut off. So Sushruta was repairing a lot of ruined lives. Right? The world is an unholy mess, people. There's so many wounds and so much healing. So, one of Sushruta's tools would have been a small steel needle with a single eye. Not so different from today's sewing needles. And in fact, Sushruta talks about 3 needles, 3 different types of needles, a straight one, a curved one, and a triangular cutting one. And these 3 are all used today in modern surgery and also, I think, in modern sewing. Sushruta's treatise also describes at length the process of suturing, why you need a needle to begin with, right, to suture. And he describes different types of sutures. He deemed that process of suturing crucial, right? And he talks about the importance of irrigating the wound, getting the debris out, getting the foreign matter out, making sure it's as clean as we can make it. And then he talks about fitting the pieces of the skin together and sewing. One of the Sanskrit phrases that he uses for this work literally means to unite in order to heal. The needle is what allows us to hold the torn pieces together, creating wholeness out of what's torn, out of patchwork, a patchwork of materials. The world is an unholy mess, and not surprisingly, stitching that mess together is also a bit of a mess. Threaded with flax or cotton or ligament, tendons from animals, Sushruta's needle would have stitched the world back to a kind of wholeness. Stitching actually in faith that the wholeness is already there. Okay, that's what I got. We have time for questions, but don't test me on my surgical knowledge. Oh, and we have a microphone now, is that? Oh, my goodness. So if you're in the hall or outside and you want to talk, I guess just gasho and a mic will head your way. And if you're in the virtual hall, just unmute and dive in. We got someone over here. Hi.
I don't know if this is working, but
Oh, yeah, I don't know if it's working either.
I'll speak loud here.
Okay.
I really appreciate bringing in the metaphor of the needle. I think my non-sewing background, which thank goodness for that. There's a lot of horrible pillowcases out there. Would have thought of the needle as just that penetrating object. What I appreciate is the eye of the needle being included in that thread that carries forward. So if I understand close to what you're saying, we are carried forward with that penetrating thing, whatever that may be. And I guess my question is, the bowl of water being complete, and me entering into that wholeness. I also think about being a kid, putting my hand in the water and that light refraction and my hand looking bigger or distorted. So I wonder what you might say about as we enter into that, or at least the attempt to enter into that, how that magnifies ourselves and the distortions that come up with that.
Yeah, I think for me the image of the needle, and I'm a terrible seamstress. Yes, if you look at my robe closely, there are places that I think Genjo, you stitched this beautifully, but I've never repaired it, and I'm a terrible seamstress. But what I love about the image is that it's messy. I mean, you can't hope to heal without that distortion. It just doesn't look tidy. There will be seams. At least that's how it feels to this human life, this completely fallible and flawed and messed up human. It's a messy business. My mom was it's another true story. My mom was a dermatologist, and dermatologists perform a bunch of minor surgeries all the time. And our dog Spiegel got hit by a bicycle once, which, Spiegel is not I was about to say not the sharpest dog in the world, but that's sort of an unfortunate metaphor when we're talking about piercing objects. But Spiegel got hit by a bicycle, and she had this gash on her leg, and my mom just sort of gamely thought, I am going to fix Spiegel. And she took Spiegel and put her on the kitchen table and pulled out her sewing kit. And I'm like, Mom, you cannot sew the dog on the kitchen table, which thank goodness she did not do. But there is something about that impulse, let's just meet this moment. Well, we got Spiegel taken care of, don't worry. So, yeah, there will be distortion. Yeah.
Very intimidating. We've been talking about the needle as our own heart of awakening, as diving in, and I was just struck thinking about it as one of his few possessions of how well that illustrates the generosity, the relinquishment that is required to dive in with our whole heart.
Yeah. And the part of it that I was thinking about when I was thinking about this Dharma talk, that, then you cannot mend your robe anymore. So there's also, the relinquishment has also this piece of, it's just going to it's just impermanence. It's just mortality. Yeah. Relinquishment is hard. Well, in a week's time, we'll be gathered back here. And, this idea of the assembly as a coming together and a stitching together of our lives as a response to our teacher, as our response to our own yearning hearts. I feel like I've shared with you a bunch of bloody images and a lot of talk about the world's unholy mess. But the sun is shining, and although I'm shivering because I'm facing an open door, I'm facing a glorious autumn day with my beloved Sangha, with my teacher, with my life partner. So sometimes this unholy mess looks pretty darn sanctified. Pretty darn sanctified. So, sorry. Thank you all so much. Ooh.